I am Captain Millie Walker, 29 years old. Last Thanksgiving, my father, a retired judge, stood before 32 relatives and barked a grounding order at me like I was some bratty kid, just because I dared to mention my grandmother's will. The entire clan erupted in laughter at an army officer. My jaw tightened. But I looked him dead in the eye, cold as ice, and replied with a single word, "Roger." The next morning, he pounded on my door, smirking. "Finally learned your place, huh?" Then he froze when he saw the room was empty. I was gone. The bed was made with military precision, hospital corners tight enough to bounce a quarter. Just as he started laughing, thinking I'd deserted, the doorbell rang. Lawyer Harold Caldwell stood there, calm and unblinking, clutching a leather briefcase filled with documents my father never knew existed. He looked the former judge straight in the face and dropped a bucket of cold water. "The game's over, Richard." Before I reveal the legal bombshell inside that briefcase, hit like, subscribe, and let me know where you're listening from. Now, let me take you back to last September, the moment my grandmother took her last breath. September in Portland is a gray bruise, the kind of wet cold that digs into your marrow and stays there until you're convinced you'll never be warm again. I was 4 hours deep into a haul from Fort Lewis when the rain turned into a deluge. My hands were locked at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel of my beat-up Silverado. I didn't feel the fatigue. I didn't feel much of anything except the rhythmic, annoying slap of the wipers against the windshield. The call had come at 4 o'clock. My mother's voice was a thin wire, snapping under the weight of the news. Grandma Eleanor was gone. I hit the hospital corridor at 06:14. The floor tiles were a blinding, clinical white that made my head throb. The air tasted of industrial bleach and that heavy, cloying cologne my father has worn for 30 years. Richard Walker was already there. He stood in the center of the hallway like he owned the entire wing, dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my first 2 years of college. He was on his phone. He wasn't crying. He was barking about a court docket. Garrett, my older brother, stood right next to him, nodding like a bobblehead, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his expensive slacks. I walked toward them. My boots clocked against the tile, a sharp, disciplined sound that cut through the hospital hum. I stopped exactly 3 feet away. Richard didn't even break his stride in the conversation. He glanced at me, his eyes skating over my uniform with a flick of pure disdain. Then he turned his back. It wasn't an accident. It was a maneuver. To him, I wasn't a grieving granddaughter. I was a ghost, a smudge on his lens. "Garrett, make sure the clerk has the brief by noon." Richard snapped into the receiver. He hung up and clapped Garrett on the shoulder, ignoring my existence entirely. "Good boy. You're the only one I can count on to keep this family's head above water." I stood there, my throat feeling like it was lined with broken glass. "Dad." He didn't turn. He just walked toward the elevator with Garrett trailing behind him like a loyal shadow. I watched the doors slide shut. The silence that followed was louder than any mortar blast I'd ever heard downrange. The funeral was 3 days later. A granite church in the hills, the kind of place where old money goes to pretend it's holy. The sky was the color of a wet sidewalk. I was in my Class A's, every button polished to a mirror finish, every ribbon straight. I stood in the back, the cold dampness of the Oregon air seeping through my tunic. Richard took the podium. He didn't look like a man who'd just lost his mother. He looked like a politician at a rally. His voice boomed, echoing off the high stone arches. He talked about legacy. He talked about the Walker name. "My son, Garrett," Richard said, his chest swelling with pride. "A man of the law. A man who understands what it means to carry this family into the future. The true pillar of our lineage." He said Garrett's name 4 times. He mentioned the law firm. He mentioned the civic awards. He even managed to squeeze in a mention of my mother, Linda, calling her a faithful companion. But me? He never even looked my way. I waited for it. A mention of the granddaughter who'd spent her life serving. the one who'd sent half her hazard pay home every month to keep Grandma's house from being seized when Richard tried to liquidate it years ago. Nothing. Not a word. He stepped down to a murmur of approval. I stayed in the corner of the transept, hands locked behind my back in a rigid parade rest. My knuckles were white. I could feel my nails digging into my palms, the sharp sting of skin breaking, but I didn't blink. I didn't let a single muscle in my face twitch. If he wanted me invisible, I'd be a statue. The wake was held at the Hawthorne estate. 32 relatives, all nursing bourbon and talking about the estate like vultures circling a kill. I was in the kitchen, stacking dirty plates. Habits die hard. You see a mess, you clear it. My Uncle Dan wandered in, glass in hand. He looked at my uniform, then at my face. Millie. Hard to keep track of where you are these days. You doing okay? I opened my mouth to tell him about the logistics chain I was managing, the millions of dollars in equipment I was responsible for. But before I could speak, the door swung open. Richard walked in. He didn't look at me. He looked at Dan. Don't bother, Dan, Richard said, his voice dripping with a casual, oily contempt. He threw a smirk over his shoulder at me. She's just a dirt roller, only knows how to take orders and dig foxholes. Don't go asking her about the economy or the family business. It'd be like talking to the hired help. A few cousins standing in the doorway erupted in a muffled, snickering chorus. I froze. The plate in my hand felt heavy as a lead weight. My jaw was clamped so tight it ached. I've stared down real threats without breaking a sweat, but here, under the harsh yellow lights of my father's kitchen, I felt the walls closing in. I was an officer. I had a rank. I had respect everywhere else in the world except in my own home. I gotta go, I muttered. I pushed past them, needing air before I did something that would get me court-martialed. I was halfway across the patio when a shadow moved. The buffet line was thinning out. An old man stood by the hedge. He was wearing a worn-out trench coat and thick glasses with gold rims. He looked like a relic. He didn't say a word as I approached. He just stepped into my path and reached out. His hand was dry, like parchment, but his grip was iron. He took my right hand and pressed something into my palm. Your grandmother was very proud of you, Captain, he whispered. His voice was a low rasp, like tires on gravel. Don't listen to the noise. They don't know what's coming. I'll call you soon. He let go and disappeared into the rainy darkness before I could even blink. I opened my hand. It was a business card, heavy stock, embossed lettering, Harold Caldwell, attorney at law. I looked back at the house. The lights were blazing. I could hear Richard's booming laugh from the living room. I looked at the card again. In the darkness, that embossed ink felt like a promise, a tactical advantage they didn't even know I had. A cold, sharp spark ignited in my chest. For the first time since that 4 o'clock phone call, the invisible girl started to see a way out. The dinner table was a battlefield where I had no weapons. At least, not yet. 15 of us were packed into the dining room of the Hawthorne Street estate. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of a $60 Cabernet and the steam from a prime rib that probably cost more than my monthly base pay. Richard sat at the head of the long oak table, his back straight, his eyes scanning the room like he was still presiding over the county court. He had that way of looking at people, like they were all just evidence he hadn't decided to throw out yet. Clink, clink, clink. He tapped his sterling silver fork against the rim of a crystal glass. The sound was sharp, brittle enough to cut. The room went dead silent. My cousins stopped mid-laugh. My aunts froze, napkins halfway to their mouths. I've made a decision regarding the estate, Richard announced. He didn't say we. He didn't consult the ghost of his mother. He just spoke. I'll be distributing the assets based on competence, real-world capability. He turned that judge stare on me. It was cold, dismissive. The kind of look you give a stray dog that's managed to find its way into a high-end steakhouse. That means you don't need to worry your head about it, Millie, he said, a jagged little smirk playing on his lips. These numbers ain't in your infantry manual. They require a mind for finance, not just a knack for digging holes and following orders. A few of my cousins snickered. I felt the heat rise in my neck, but I didn't move. I've managed multi-million-dollar supply chains across 3 continents, but in this room, I was just the daughter who went off to play soldier. I was the uneducated one because I didn't have a law degree from an Ivy League. Grandma Eleanor promised me the beach cottage, Dad, I said. My voice was low, level. I kept my breathing steady. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out. Richard's hand slammed down on the table. The plates rattled. The wine in his glass sloshed over the rim, staining the white linen like a fresh wound. She was senile, he roared. His face turned a mottled shade of purple. She was out of her mind when she said that. You think you're gonna stand here and challenge me? In my own house? I reckon you've forgotten who's in charge here, girl. He swung his gaze toward my mother. Mom flinched. She looked down at her soup bowl, her shoulders hunched like she was expecting a blow. Her hands were shaking so hard she couldn't even pick up her spoon. She didn't say a word. She never did. She just sat there, disappearing into the wallpaper while her husband tore into her daughter. I looked around the table. Nobody moved. Nobody defended her. In this house, justice didn't exist. There was only the judge. I'm tired, I said, standing up. The chair legs scraped harshly against the hardwood floor. Long drive. I didn't wait for permission. I turned and walked out, the sound of my boots heavy and rhythmic. I climbed the stairs to the attic, the old room I'd spent my teenage years in. It was a dusty museum of a life I'd tried to outrun. The air was stale, smelling of old paper, mothballs, and damp insulation. I didn't turn on the light. I didn't need to. I knew every inch of this space. I went into tactical mode. It was a habit I couldn't turn off. I started at the door and worked my way inward. I checked the closet, the drawers. I ran my fingers along the window frame. Then I moved to the bed. I stripped the moth-eaten quilt and flipped the mattress. There. A thin, jagged crack in the plywood base of the bed frame. I pried it up with the blade of my pocket knife. Taped to the underside was a heavy, cream-colored envelope. In the corner, a single, elegant letter was embossed in the paper. E. Eleanor. My heart hammered against my ribs. I sliced the tape and pulled out a single sheet of stationery and a thick stack of legal-sized paper. The letter was in Grandma's shaky, elegant hand. Millie, I'm sorry. Men like your father don't hear women. They only see what they want to see. They think we're weak because we're quiet. But they don't understand that quiet people are the ones who do the most work. They only fear paperwork, Millie. Don't let them grind you down. Underneath the letter was the prize. Irrevocable trust agreement. I didn't need a law degree to understand those 2 words. Irrevocable. It meant it couldn't be changed. Not by a judge, not by a son, not by anyone. I flipped through the pages. My eyes landed on a section near the end. Someone, Grandma, had used a neon yellow highlighter. The ink was so bright it practically vibrated off the page in the dim light. Sole beneficiary, Millie Walker. The assets weren't just the cottage. It was the house I was standing in. It was the accounts Richard was currently bragging about downstairs. Everything he thought he'd distributed already belonged to me. Listen, if you've ever been the one in the family that everyone overlooked, the one they treated like a nobody while you were out there building your own life, I want you to hit that like button right now. Comment the word truth if you know that feeling of finally holding the winning card while they think they've already won. I'm reading every single one of your stories tonight. I stood there in the dark, the document clutched in my hand. Downstairs, I heard Richard bark another laugh. He was probably telling another story about how I was unfit to handle the family legacy. He was probably laughing about how he'd put me in my place. I didn't feel the anger anymore, not the hot, messy kind that makes you scream. This was cold, analytical. This was the feeling of mission parameters shifting. He thought I was a dirt roller. He thought I was just someone who followed orders. He was wrong. I was a captain. And I'd just been handed the ultimate weapon. I folded the papers carefully, tucking them inside my jacket. I walked to the window and looked down at the driveway. Richard's Mercedes was parked there, shining under the streetlights. He didn't know it yet, but he was already homeless. The war had officially started, and I was the only one who had the map. 3 weeks back at the base. 3 weeks of the same gray Oregon sky and the same rhythmic thud of combat boots hitting the asphalt. I leaned into the straps of my rucksack, 45 pounds of dead weight digging into my traps. My legs felt like lead, but my mind was a vacuum. That's how I liked it. No thoughts of Hawthorne Street, no sound of Richard's voice, just the gravel, the sweat stinging my eyes, and the 10-mile marker waiting at the end of the road. The military is simple. You have a mission. You have a rank. You have a chain of command that doesn't care about your feelings, only your results. I've lived in this world since I was 19. It was my armor. It was the only place where being a quiet girl didn't mean you were a doormat. It meant you were an asset. When I got back to my quarters, the shower didn't wash off the day. It just highlighted the bruises. I sat at my small desk, the light from a single lamp casting long shadows across the olive drab walls. My phone buzzed on the wood. Another text from Richard. The trust needs to be consolidated, Millie. Don't be difficult. You don't understand how the market is moving. Give Garrett the authorization. I didn't reply. I never did. Instead, I pulled up my banking app and transferred $500 to my mother's private account, the one Richard didn't know about. I'd been doing it for years. It was the only way she could buy groceries or gas without him auditing the receipt and shouting for an hour about wasteful spending. Everything felt locked down, secure. I was the officer in charge of my own life again. Then came Thursday, 22:15. I was staring at a logistics manifest for next month's training exercise when the ping of a new email cut through the silence. My eyes were burning, dry from the blue light. I reached for my mug, but the coffee was stone cold, a bitter film forming on the surface. The sender was Garrett Walker, my big brother. The golden boy lawyer who'd never spent a night in the dirt in his life. The subject line, FWD, RE Trust Revision, Petition. I clicked it, expecting another patronizing demand for my signature. But as the thread loaded, I realized something was off. Garrett had hit reply all. He'd included me in a chain between him, Richard, and some high-priced legal consultant in Portland. The screen was too bright. It felt like it was searing into my retinas. I scrolled down. My eyes caught words that felt like shrapnel hitting a glass wall. Psychological instability, post-service trauma, evidence of fiscal irresponsibility. My brother wasn't just asking for the trust. He was building a case to prove I was unfit to hold it. He was drafting a petition to the court to have me declared mentally incompetent. Millie's history in the service gives us the leverage we need, Garrett had written to Richard just 2 hours earlier. We can frame the beach house purchase as an impulsive symptom of PTSD. The judge will look at her military record and see a damaged veteran, not a beneficiary. It's an easy win. The bitterness in my throat wasn't just the coffee anymore. It was bile. I leaned back, the plastic chair creaking under my weight. I looked at the wall, at the framed photo of me and Garrett when we were kids at the lake. He'd taught me how to fish. He'd promised to look out for me. Now, he was using the very thing I gave my life to, my service, as a weapon to rob me. Then I saw the final line of his email, the one that stopped my heart. "Don't worry, Dad," Garrett wrote. "She won't fight back. She's been conditioned to follow orders for 10 years. It's the best part about her. She'll just stand there at parade rest and say, 'Roger,' while we take the keys. She doesn't have the stomach for a real fight." The room went silent. Not the quiet of the base at night, but a vacuum seal kind of silence. The kind right before an IED goes off. I looked at the cursor blinking on the screen. He thought my discipline was a weakness. He thought my silence was permission. He thought the girl who'd managed 40 tons of munitions in a war zone would crumble because her big brother told her to. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. That would be unstable, wouldn't it? I reached out and took a long, slow sip of that cold, sludge-like coffee. It tasted like ink and iron. My hands didn't shake. I moved the mouse with the same precision I used to zero a rifle. File, download. I grabbed an encrypted USB drive from my drawer and jammed it into the port. Select all, copy. I watched the progress bar crawl across the screen. Each percentage point was another nail in Garrett's coffin. I made 3 copies, 1 on the drive, 2 on separate cloud servers. I wasn't a daughter anymore. I was a counterintelligence officer, and my targets had just exposed their entire flank. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark. I breathed. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out. Box breathing. It clears the static. It turns off the nerves. The clock on the wall ticked toward midnight. I stared at the ceiling until the sun started to bleed through the blinds. Exactly at 0800, I picked up my phone. I dialed the number on the embossed card I'd hidden in my locker. Caldwell. A gravelly voice answered on the second ring. This is Captain Walker, I said. My voice was as flat and sharp as a razor blade. I have the emails. They're filing for a competency hearing. They're claiming I'm broken. There was a pause on the other end. I heard the sound of a match striking and a long exhale of smoke. That's a heavy play, Captain, Caldwell said. What do you want to do? I want you to prep the countersuit, I replied. I looked at my reflection in the window. I didn't recognize the girl staring back. Fraud, libel, conspiracy. And I want the trust liquidated and the Hawthorne House titles ready for transfer. When do we move? Thanksgiving, I said. The judge likes to hold court at dinner. We're going to let him have his audience one last time. I hung up and stood at the window. The base was waking up. Soldiers were running in formation, their voices chanting a cadence in the distance. Garrett was right about one thing. I was trained to obey. I was trained to follow the rules of engagement. But he forgot the most important rule of combat. Never underestimate the person who knows exactly how much ammunition you have left. The trap was set. Now all I had to do was wait for the holiday. The Hawthorne estate glowed like a stage set for a high-end commercial. From the curb, the house looked perfect. Warm yellow lights spilling out of every window. The smell of roasted turkey and expensive bourbon drifting into the damp Portland night. But as I stepped onto the porch, the air felt thin. Toxic. 32 relatives were packed inside, their voices a dull, hungry roar that vibrated through the heavy oak door. I took a breath and pushed inside. Nobody looked up. Nobody offered a drink. I was a ghost in a room full of people sharing my last name. My sister-in-law, Meredith, spotted me from across the foyer. She was wearing a silk dress that cost more than a month's worth of my hazard pay. She didn't smile. She just crooked a finger and pointed toward the back corner of the kitchen, near the mudroom. We're tight on space, honey, Meredith said, her voice dripping with a fake, sugary sympathy. We put a folding table back there for you. It's right next to the kids. She was pointing at a wobbly, beige plastic table. The kind you buy at a drugstore for $20. It sat on the hardwood floor like an insult. I looked at the 3 8-year-olds already sitting there, smeared with gravy and screaming about video games. My throat went tight. A year ago, I was sitting in a tactical command center in Afghanistan, directing tens of millions of dollars in military hardware, deciding which convoys moved and which stayed put. Generals listened when I spoke. Here, in the house I grew up in, I was being demoted to the kids' table. I walked over. The screech of the plastic table legs against the floor sounded like a scream. I sat down. My knees hit the underside of the flimsy top. I just stared at my empty plate, my back straight as a yardstick. In the dining room, Richard stood up. He was at the head of the main table, a glass of aged bourbon in his hand. He looked like a king. He spent 10 minutes praising Garrett's law firm, talking about billable hours and the Walker legacy. The relatives hung on every word, nodding like bobbleheads. One of my uncles, drunk on wine, leaned over and tried to ask me about my deployment. "So, Millie, you still moving boxes for the army, or what?" Before I could get a word out, Richard's voice cut through the room like a whip. He didn't even look at me. He kept his eyes on the crowd. "Every family needs a placeholder, Dan," Richard said. He let out a loud, booming laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "Someone's got to stay in the dirt so the rest of us can move up." "Right, Millie. She's real good at staying in the dirt." The room erupted. 31 people roared with laughter. It was a jagged, ugly sound that hammered into my eardrums. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I just watched a single drop of condensation slide down my water glass. I stayed there for an hour, a statue at a plastic table. When the plates were cleared, I grabbed a stack of dirty forks and walked into the kitchen. I needed the walls to stop closing in. I was at the sink when Garrett drifted in. He smelled like expensive tobacco and arrogance. He leaned against the counter, blocking my path, swirling a fresh drink in his hand. He looked at me with a smirk that made my skin crawl. "You look comfortable back there, sis," Garrett whispered. "Fits you. Nice and simple. No big decisions to make. Just how you like it." I turned off the faucet. The silence in the kitchen was heavy. I looked him dead in the eye, the same look I used when I had to tell a contractor their shipment was seized. "Garrett," I said, my voice low and flat, "do you actually know what Grandma Eleanor left me? Do you have any idea what's in that safe deposit box she mentioned?" The smirk died. It didn't just fade, it vanished. Garrett's face went the color of old chalk. He stammered, his glass shaking just enough to make the ice clink. He didn't answer. He turned on his heel, nearly tripping over his own feet, and ran into the dining room to find Dad. 10 minutes later, the house went dead silent. Richard stormed into the kitchen. The heavy thud of his heels sounded like a death march. The relatives crowded the doorway, peering in like they were at a car wreck. Richard's face was a mottled purple, the veins in his neck bulging. He stopped inches from my face, his finger trembling as he pointed it at my nose. "You dare?" he hissed. His voice was a low growl that shook with rage. "You come into my house and threaten your brother? You think your little games matter here? You're grounded, Millie, just like when you were 16. You're grounded until you learn to open your mouth and apologize to this family. Go to your room. Now!" Meredith let out a sharp, jagged giggle from the hallway. Aunt Margaret turned her head, pretending to look at a painting. My mother, Linda, stood at the back of the crowd, her eyes glued to the lace tablecloth, her hands knotted together. She didn't say a word. She didn't even look at me. The humiliation was a physical weight in my chest, a hot, thick pressure rising up my throat. My vision blurred for a split second, but then the training kicked in. Box breathing. In for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 4. Hold for 4. The noise in my head stopped. The anger didn't go away, it just turned to ice. It became a tool. I snapped my heels together, my back rigid, my arms locked at my sides. I stared through my father, looking at the wall behind him. "Roger," I said. The word was a jagged piece of flint. I didn't wait for him to move. I walked past him, my shoulder brushing his suit, and headed for the stairs. Every eye in the house was on me. I didn't look back. I went into my old room, shut the door, and locked it. I didn't turn on the light. I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, listening to the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses starting up again downstairs. They thought they'd won. They thought they'd put the soldier back in her cage. I pulled my phone from my pocket. My thumb hovered over the contact. I pressed dial. "Caldwell," the voice rasped on the first ring. "It's time," I said. My voice was a dead thing. 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Open fire. I hung up and tossed the phone on the quilt. Below me, someone shouted a toast. Let them drink. Let them laugh. Tonight was the last night they'd ever sleep in this house. 4:15. Portland was a ghost world. A thick, wet fog crawled off the Willamette River, swallowing the streetlights and turning the Hawthorne estate into a jagged shadow. Inside the house, the silence was heavy, smelling of stale bourbon and the cold grease of a turkey carcass left on the counter. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't need to. I moved through the dark with the muscle memory of a scout. My tactical rucksack was already packed. One change of clothes, my laptop, the thumb drive, and the cream-colored envelope from the attic. I looked at the bed one last time. The blankets were folded with hospital corners so sharp they could draw blood. Precision, discipline. It was the only thing they hadn't been able to take from me. I reached out and touched the framed photo of Grandma Eleanor on the nightstand. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, I turned it face down. The click of the front door lock was a tiny, sharp snap in the fog. I stepped onto the porch, the air hitting my lungs like a sheet of ice. I didn't look back. I didn't say goodbye. You don't say goodbye to a burning bridge. You just keep walking. I slid into the Silverado, the engine turning over with a low, throaty growl that felt like a secret. I drove 3 miles to a 24-hour diner on the edge of the industrial district. The neon sign hummed, a flickering blue D buzzing against the gray sky. I sat in a corner booth, the vinyl seat cracked and cold against my thighs. Black? No sugar, I told the waitress. She slid a thick ceramic mug across the laminate table. It was hot, bitter, and tasted like ash. Perfect. I opened my laptop and watched the clock. 7:30. Back at the house, the king was waking up. Richard Walker took his first sip of coffee, feeling the warm glow of a man who'd finally crushed a rebellion. He liked the weight of the house. He liked the silence. He climbed the stairs, his silk robe billowing, ready to deliver one last sermon to the daughter he'd grounded. He wanted to see the look in my eyes when I finally broke. He kicked the door open without knocking. Time to wake up, Millie. We've got a long day of... The word died in his throat. The room was a vacuum. No mess, no clothes on the floor, just a bed so perfectly made it looked like a museum exhibit. And that photo, face down on the table. Richard walked back down the stairs, his heels clicking fast and nervous on the wood. Garrett was in the kitchen, nursing a hangover and looking at his phone. "She's gone," Richard said. A jagged, ugly smirk started to crawl across his face. The coward deserted in the middle of the night. She couldn't handle the heat. The only thing in our way just ran off like a scared dog. Garrett let out a long, shaky breath of relief. He straightened his tie, his ego inflating like a punctured tire being patched with duct tape. "Told you, Dad. She's trained to follow orders. She knew she lost." They stood there for a minute, basking in the hollow victory of the wicked. They thought the game was over. They thought they'd won. Then the doorbell rang. It wasn't the polite chime of a neighbor. It was a long, aggressive buzz that echoed through the foyer like an alarm. Richard marched to the door, his chest puffed out, ready to bark at whoever was interrupting his triumph. He yanked the door open. Harold Caldwell stood on the porch. He looked like something carved out of old granite. He wore a charcoal trench coat that had seen better decades and held a brown leather briefcase that looked like it had been through a war. His eyes were behind thick, gold-rimmed glasses, and they didn't move. "What the hell are you doing here, Harold?" Richard roared. His face was already turning that mottled purple color. "I told you to stay off my property. Get lost before I call the cops and have you hauled off for trespassing." Caldwell didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He just adjusted his grip on the briefcase, the brass latch clicking in the silence. "Go ahead, Richard. Call them," Caldwell said. His voice was a dry, dusty rasp that carried the weight of 40 years in a courtroom. "I'd love for the police to be here when I show them the petition you filed with the county clerk yesterday." Richard's mouth snapped shut. "I don't know what you're talking about." I think you do, Caldwell said, stepping forward, forcing Richard to take a half step back into his own house. The petition where you swore under oath, under penalty of perjury, that you were unable to locate your daughter. The petition where you claimed she disappeared and was mentally unfit to be served with legal notice. Richard's face went from purple to a sick, chalky white. The word perjury hit him like a physical blow. A former judge being caught in a flat-out lie to the court wasn't just a scandal. It was a prison sentence. Garrett appeared in the hallway, his hand gripping his father's arm so hard his knuckles were white. Dad, we need to talk in private. Caldwell looked past Richard, his eyes locking onto Garrett like a hawk spotting a field mouse. The lawyer didn't smile. He just checked his watch. You've got 6 hours of privacy left, Caldwell said. He turned on his heel, his coat snapping in the cold wind. He walked down the steps, his boots heavy and rhythmic on the stone. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs and looked back over his shoulder. I'll be back at 1400 for the reading of the will. My client has provided some additional documentation that you seem to have overlooked. Millie isn't here, Richard shouted, his voice cracking, desperate to regain control. She ran off. Caldwell gave a short, sharp nod. She didn't run, Richard. She just repositioned. And when I come back this afternoon, I won't be coming alone. The lawyer climbed into his old black sedan and pulled away into the fog. Richard stood in the doorway, the cold air rushing into his warm house. He looked at the empty street, then back at his son. For the first time in 63 years, the judge looked like a man who was terrified of the verdict. Up at the diner, I closed my laptop. I looked at the business card on the table. The time was 08:05. The clock was ticking. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one waiting for orders. I was the one giving them. 1400. The living room of the Hawthorne estate felt like a pressure cooker. 30 relatives were squeezed into the space, the air thick with the smell of cheap floral perfume and the nervous sweat of people waiting for a payout. Richard stood by the fireplace, legs braced, holding a single sheet of typed paper like it was a holy scroll. He looked every bit the judge, stern, untouchable, and utterly convinced of his own power. I've spent a lifetime upholding the law, Richard's voice boomed, echoing off the high ceiling. And it's my duty to ensure Eleanor's legacy is handled with the respect it deserves. Therefore, the primary trust of $620,000 will be transferred to Garrett Walker. He has the legal expertise to grow this family's influence. He paused, a flicker of something cruel crossing his face. As for Millie, despite her decision to walk out on us this morning, I'm setting aside $5,000 as a support fund. Every family has its workers, and every family has its ghosts. She's chosen her path. A few aunts nodded, their eyes already calculating their own cuts. Garrett stood by the window, adjusting his silk tie, a small, greasy smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Then, the heavy deadbolt on the front door turned. Clack. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent room. The door swung open, hitting the stopper with a dull thud. I walked in first. I wasn't wearing a suit or a dress. I was in my worn-out jeans, a dark field jacket, and my boots were still stained with the mud from the base. My back was a straight line. I didn't look at the relatives. I didn't look at the furniture. I looked at the target. Harold Caldwell followed me, his leather briefcase clicking as he stepped onto the hardwood. Richard's face went a dark, angry purple. He pointed a trembling finger at me. You've got a lot of nerve showing up here after your little desertion. You want to apologize? Do it now, or get out. You're trespassing in my house. I walked right past his pointing finger and stopped 3 feet from the coffee table. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. I'm not here to apologize, Richard, I said. My voice was as cold and flat as a winter morning in the Cascades. I'm here to stop a robbery. I reached into my jacket and pulled out a folder bound in heavy cardstock, stamped with a bright red seal. I didn't place it on the glass table. I dropped it. The sound made Garrett jump. Caldwell stepped forward, his eyes sharp behind his gold-rimmed glasses. He didn't wait for permission. He opened his briefcase and pulled out the first document. The trust fund at U.S. Bank that you just mentioned, Richard? The one for $620,000? Caldwell's voice was a dry rasp that filled every corner of the room. It is an irrevocable trust, signed and notarized 2 years ago. There is only one named beneficiary, Captain Millie Walker. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Aunt Margaret dropped her glass, the ice clinking against the floor. Richard's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish gasping for air on a hot pier. "That's a lie," Garrett shouted, his voice cracking. "I saw the original draft. Dad has the power of attorney." "The draft you saw was a decoy, Garrett," Caldwell said, his tone bored. He pulled out a second set of papers. "And as for the trespassing comment, this house, the Hawthorne estate, was never in Richard's name. It was held in a separate life estate. Upon Eleanor's death, the title transferred immediately." Caldwell tossed the deed onto the table. "Millie Walker is the sole owner of this property. Richard, you aren't the judge here. You're a guest. And your invitation just expired." The shift in the room was violent. The relatives who had been nodding at Richard 10 minutes ago were now staring at me like I was a stranger who just walked in with a winning lottery ticket. The power was hemorrhaging out of my father's face. He looked smaller, older. Richard lunged for the table, his hands shaking so hard he nearly tore the papers. "She was senile," he screamed, his voice hitting a jagged, desperate note. My mother was out of her mind. She was confused. She didn't know what she was signing. "I'll have this whole thing thrown out in an hour. You're taking advantage of a dead woman's dementia." Garrett backed away toward the wall, his face the color of a wet sidewalk. He knew. He was a lawyer, and he saw the walls closing in. I looked at my father. I didn't feel pity. I didn't feel hate. I just felt the mission parameters being met. Caldwell reached into the very back of his briefcase. He pulled out a single thin sheet of paper protected by a plastic sleeve. "We anticipated that play, Richard," Caldwell said. He held the paper up for everyone to see. "This is a comprehensive cognitive evaluation performed by Dr. Eris Thorne, Chief of Psychiatry. Date: 3 days before the will was finalized. Eleanor scored a 93% on her cognitive tests. She was more lucid than most of the people in this room." He dropped the final bomb. "The report specifically notes that she wanted these changes made because she felt her son and grandson were, and I quote, predatory and untrustworthy." Richard slumped against the mantel. The king was gone. In his place was just a bitter old man in a charcoal suit that didn't fit him anymore. "I want to stop right here. If you've ever been the one the family counted out, the one they called unstable or incapable just because you didn't play their game, I want you to hit that like button right now. Give me a Roger in the comments if you've ever sat at that kid's table while the real sharks were trying to eat your future. I see you." I looked around the room. The relatives were dead silent. My mother was standing in the shadows of the hallway, her hand over her mouth. I turned back to Richard. He was staring at the floor, his chest heaving. "You called me a placeholder, Dad," I said. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a razor. "You said every family needs one, so the others can move up." I leaned in, close enough to smell the stale bourbon on his breath. "You were right, but you got the roles mixed up. You're the placeholder, and your time is up." I turned to Caldwell. "Get the eviction notices ready. I want this house cleared by Monday." I walked out the front door without looking back. Behind me, I heard the first sounds of the vultures starting to turn on each other. The silence in the living room wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence you find in a graveyard right before the ground starts to shift. 32 pairs of eyes were locked on Richard, but he wasn't looking back at them. He was staring at the pile of papers on the coffee table like they were live grenades. The king of Hawthorne Street was bleeding power, and everyone in the room could smell it. The alliance broke first. It's funny how fast people run when the ship starts taking on water. Meredith, who had spent the last hour clinging to Garrett's arm like a status symbol, suddenly recoiled. She stepped back into the shadows of the foyer, her hands up as if to say she was never part of the deal. She didn't want the stain of a fraud case on her silk dress. Richard turned on Garrett. His face was a dark, bruised purple, the veins in his temples throbbing. He didn't look like a judge anymore. He looked like a cornered animal. "Do something," Richard barked, his voice cracking. "You're the damn lawyer. Find a loophole. Tell them these papers are fakes. Tell them she's lying." Garrett didn't move. He was shaking. Not just his hands, but his whole frame. He looked at the irrevocable stamp on the top sheet and let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. It was the sound of a man who realized he'd spent his whole life building a house of cards on a windy beach. "I can't, Dad," Garrett whimpered. He didn't even try to lower his voice. "It's over. Irrevocable means exactly what it says. There ain't no back door. I told you we shouldn't have pushed it this far. I told you." Richard's hand, the one holding the half-full glass of bourbon, began to tremble violently. He looked around the room, searching for an ally, a friendly face, someone to tell him he was still in charge. But Uncle Dan was looking at the floor. Aunt Margaret was busy inspecting her fingernails. The vultures were done with him. Smash! The glass slipped from his fingers. It hit the hardwood and exploded into 100 jagged diamonds. The expensive red wine splashed across the cream-colored rug, spreading out like a fresh, dark wound. Richard didn't even flinch. He just stood there, breathing in short, wet gasps. "Millie," he whispered. The room went stiller, if that was even possible. Richard dropped his shoulders. He let his head hang for a second, then looked up at me. The rage was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous. The fake, oily sheen of a man playing the victim. He'd spent 30 years on the bench watching criminals do this. He knew the script. "Millie, honey," he said, his voice dropping into a low, fatherly rasp. "You don't understand the world. You're a soldier. You see things in black and white. I wasn't trying to steal from you. I was trying to save you. You don't know how to handle this kind of money. People would have taken advantage of you. I did it to keep the family legacy whole. I did it because I love you." I felt the air in the room thicken. I'd heard that line 1,000 times growing up. I did it because I love you. He'd used it when he grounded me for 3 weeks for getting a B in history. He'd used it when he told me my military service was a waste of a good Walker brain. He'd used it to keep my mother in her place for 35 years. I stood my ground. My back was a steel rod. I didn't let my expression change. I didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing my anger. "Love?" I said. The word felt like a stone in my mouth. I walked over to him, stepping right through the puddle of wine. The glass crunched under my boots. I stopped when I was inches from his face, close enough to see the gray stubble on his jaw and the fear behind his eyes. "You don't know the first thing about love, Richard," I said. My voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of that room. Love is about sacrifice. Love is about seeing someone for who they are and helping them grow. What you have isn't love. It's a ledger. You only value people for how much they obey you. You didn't hide that will to protect me. You did it because you couldn't stand the idea of a daughter having something you couldn't control. I leaned in closer, my voice dropping to a whisper that only he could hear. The placeholder is done taking orders, and the judge is out of appeals. Richard's mouth worked, but no words came out. He looked like he'd been slapped. The mask was gone. The dignified former judge was just a bitter, lonely old man in an expensive suit. "He's right, Millie." The voice came from the back of the room. It was thin, shaky, but it didn't break. My mother, Linda, stepped out of the shadows. She'd spent 35 years disappearing, turning herself into a ghost so Richard wouldn't have a target to hit. But today she looked different. She wasn't looking at the floor. She was looking straight at her husband. "He's right about one thing," Mom said, her voice getting stronger with every word. You owe her, Richard. You owe this girl an apology for every time you told her she wasn't enough. You owe her for every lie you told to keep her under your thumb. She walked over and stood next to me. She didn't touch me, but I could feel the heat of her presence. It was the first time in my life I hadn't felt alone in this house. And you owe me too, she added, her eyes burning into his. Richard looked at her like he didn't recognize her. He looked at the relatives. He looked at the wine-stained rug. He was a man who'd lost his court, his jury, and his home all in one afternoon. He didn't say a word. He didn't apologize. He couldn't. He turned on his heel and walked toward his heavy oak office door. He looked smaller with every step. He didn't look back as he stepped inside and slammed the door. The sound echoed through the house like a final verdict. The king was gone. And for the first time in my life, I could finally breathe. I looked at Caldwell. He was already clicking his briefcase shut. He gave me a short, sharp nod. The mission was accomplished. I want the locks changed by 1800, I said. I looked at the relatives. The party's over. Get out. I didn't wait to see them leave. I walked toward the kitchen to find a trash bag. There was a lot of garbage in this house that needed to be thrown away. 2 weeks after the smoke cleared on Hawthorne Street, the world looked different. The sky over Portland was a flat, bruised purple, leaking a cold drizzle that turned the pavement slick. I sat in my Silverado, the heater humming a low, steady tune. I pulled up my banking app, $620,000. The number looked surreal against the glowing screen, a long string of zeros that represented every lie they'd told and every bit of peace they'd tried to steal. The house was officially mine. The deed was recorded, the seals were dry, and the locks were new. Caldwell hadn't wasted any time. He'd delivered the 30-day eviction notice in person, taped it right to the front door like a declaration of war. Richard hadn't fought it. He couldn't. Not after the perjury threat. He'd spent his life handing out judgments, but he didn't have a leg to stand on when the law finally turned its cold, blind eye on him. The fallout inside the house was even uglier. My mother, Linda, didn't wait for the 30 days. She'd spent 3 decades being the shadow in the corner, but the morning after Thanksgiving, she just stopped. No screaming match, no long-winded goodbye. She just packed 2 suitcases, called my aunt in Seattle, and walked out while Richard was still in his bathrobe, shouting at a lawyer on the phone. She didn't look back at him. Not once. She'd found her spine in the wreckage of his ego, and she was gone before the coffee got cold. Richard was left in a vacuum, a king with no subjects and a house he didn't own. Then there was Garrett. My big brother had always walked around like his law degree was a suit of armor, but the Oregon State Bar doesn't take kindly to attorneys who use their firm's servers to plot trust fraud against their own siblings. Caldwell had made sure the reply all thread landed on the right desks. The investigation was swift. Garrett was hit with a 6-month suspension pending a full disbarment hearing. I was at the post office when I saw him for the last time before the move. He was standing next to a black BMW that was hooked up to a repo truck. The car was shiny, expensive, and utterly stolen from a life he couldn't afford anymore. Meredith was standing 10 feet away, her arms crossed tight, her face a mask of pure, icy disgust. She wasn't just leaving him, she was erasing him. She'd filed for legal separation the minute the firm's partners kicked him out of his corner office. Garrett looked at me as I drove past. He looked small. His suit was wrinkled. He didn't have a clever remark. He didn't have a smirk. He just looked like a man who'd realized he'd sold his soul for a car he couldn't keep. The final day came on a Tuesday. I stood on the sidewalk, my hands shoved deep into the pockets of my field jacket. A U-Haul truck was backed into the driveway, a rusty, dented thing that smelled of old diesel and failure. Richard came out of the front door, carrying a heavy cardboard box. It was filled with his law books, those thick, leather-bound volumes he used to quote like scripture to keep us in line. Now they were just dead weight. He looked 75, not 63. His gait was a shuffle. His hair was a mess. He didn't look at me. He walked to the back of the truck, his boots dragging on the wet concrete. Thud. He dropped the box. The sound of packing tape being ripped off the roll was the only music playing. Screech! Zip. It was the sound of a life being dismantled and shoved into a box. I watched him lugging every single crate. The once mighty judge was doing his own heavy lifting. No assistance, no Garrett, no wife. Just a bitter man and his junk. He'd spent years calling me a dirt roller, but here he was, sweating in the drizzle, his hands shaking as he tried to lift a crate of old files. The air smelled of wet cardboard and the sharp metallic scent of the shredder he'd been running for 3 days straight. He'd destroyed everything he could. Every letter, every photo, every scrap of paper that reminded him of the family he'd broken. When the truck was finally full, he closed the rolling door. The metal rattled and banged, a final hollow sound that echoed off the neighboring houses. He stood there for a long minute, looking at the Hawthorne estate. He'd lived there his whole life. He'd ruled it like a fortress. Now he was just a tenant who'd been evicted. He climbed into the cab of the U-Haul. He struggled with the gear shift, the engine groaning as he forced it into drive. He pulled away from the curb without a signal, the heavy truck lumbering down the street like a wounded beast. He was going to a 2-bedroom apartment in a part of town he used to look down on. No fireplace, no crown molding, just white walls and the sound of the neighbors through the ceiling. That night, I sat on the porch of my house. The silence was absolute. It was the first time I'd ever felt safe on these steps. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I didn't recognize the number at first, but I knew the area code. I answered. "Millie?" a voice rasped. It was thin, shaking with a pathetic kind of rage. "You really did it. You destroyed everything. Your brother's career, my reputation, this family. You tore it all down. You happy now, girl? You satisfied with the wreckage?" I looked out at the dark yard. The streetlights were flickering on, casting long orange shadows across the grass. I didn't feel the heat in my chest. I didn't feel the need to argue. "No, Dad," I said. My voice was as steady as a heartbeat. "I didn't tear anything down. You're the one who spent 30 years pouring gasoline on the floor. I'm just the one who finally stopped pretending the house wasn't on fire." "You're heartless," he hissed, "just like your grandmother." "I'll take that as a compliment," I replied. I didn't wait for his comeback. I didn't need the last word. I just pulled the phone away from my ear and hit the end call button. Then, with 3 steady taps, I blocked the number. Permanent, no contact. I leaned my head back against the porch railing and took a long, deep breath. The rain had stopped. The air was clean. The war was over. The battlefield was cleared. And for the first time in my 29 years, I didn't have to look over my shoulder. The house didn't feel like a fortress anymore. It just felt like a house. For 30 years, the Hawthorne estate had been a place where I held my breath, waiting for the floorboards to creak under Richard's heavy, judgmental stride. Now, the air was still. It didn't taste like someone else's permission. It just tasted like dust, floor wax, and the cold, sharp scent of an Oregon March. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop. The morning sun was a pale, weak sliver of light cutting through the blinds. I wasn't thinking about the $620,000. I wasn't thinking about the title in the safe. I was thinking about the perimeter. In the military, you learn that a victory is only as good as the lines you draw afterward. If you don't secure the ground you've taken, the enemy just crawls back in through the gaps. I opened my email and blind copied every relative who'd been at that disastrous Thanksgiving dinner. Subject: New rules of engagement. The message was short. I didn't use flowery language. I didn't ask for understanding. I just laid out the facts. I told them the house was mine. I told them Richard and Garrett were gone. And then I set the hard line. Do not contact me on their behalf. Do not give them my new number. Do not bring their drama to my porch. If you try to play the middleman, you're out. No exceptions, no second chances. I hit send. The click of the mouse felt like a deadbolt sliding home. 10 minutes later, the pings started. Cousin Danny sent a thumbs up. Aunt Margaret sent a single sentence. It's about damn time, Millie. Take care of yourself. Then, a final one from Garrett. Just one word. Understood. The Fear Dynasty was dead. The placeholder had rewritten the manual. I was on a long stretch of terminal leave, the kind of downtime they give you when you've spent too many years in the sun and the dirt. Most people would have gone to Vegas or sat on a beach in Maui. I went to the hardware store. I bought 5 gallons of high-gloss white primer, a heavy-duty crowbar, and a pair of leather work gloves that smelled like a new saddle. I started with Richard's study. The room was a mahogany and oak coffin. It smelled of stale cigar smoke, old leather, and the kind of arrogance that only grows in a room where people are told they're always right. I didn't just move his furniture. I gutted the space. I hammered the crowbar behind those dark, suffocating wood panels he'd bragged about for decades. Creak. The sound of the wood splintering was better than any song on the radio. I ripped it all down. Every plaque, every framed diploma, every Judge of the Year award he'd left behind, because he couldn't fit them in the U-Haul. I threw it all into a dumpster I'd rented for the week. By noon, the walls were bare, gray drywall. By sunset, they were a blinding, aggressive white. I turned the room into a nursery. Not for a kid, for seeds. I set up long steel tables and grow lights. I wanted a place that produced things instead of just judging them. I traded the law books for catalogs of perennials and landscape design manuals. My hands were covered in white paint and plaster dust, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to wash them immediately. The grit felt honest. By the 3rd week of March, the ground outside finally started to thaw. The backyard of the Hawthorne estate was a mess of dead ivy and overgrown blackberry vines, another legacy of Richard's neglect. He only cared about the front yard, the part the neighbors could see. The back was a jungle. I spent 4 days out there with a brush hog and a spade. I worked until my back screamed and my palms were a map of fresh blisters. My military training didn't go away. It just shifted targets. I attacked the weeds with the same focus I used to use for supply manifests. I cleared a 20 by 20 plot near the old stone wall. I'd ordered the bulbs months ago. Sarah Bernhardt peonies. They're the old school kind. Tough, heavy-headed flowers that take forever to bloom but stay beautiful long after everything else has dried up. They were Grandma Eleanor's favorite. She used to say they were the only things in this yard that didn't need a judge's approval to grow. I knelt in the cold, wet mud. The smell of the earth was thick and raw, the scent of things waking up after a long sleep. I used a small hand trowel to dig the holes, exactly 6 inches deep. I tucked the bulbs into the soil, my fingers feeling the rough, bark-like skin of the roots. I smoothed the dirt over them, pressing down firmly. Grow or don't, I muttered. It's up to you now. The silence of the yard was different now. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating quiet of a house under a dictator. It was the silence of a field after a storm. I stood up, my knees cracking, and wiped the sweat from my forehead with the back of my glove. I looked at the house. It looked smaller now, less like a monument and more like a project. I walked toward the back porch, my boots leaving heavy, mud-caked prints on the stone steps. I was tired in a way that sleep wouldn't fix. The kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes from finally letting go of a weight you've been carrying since you were 10 years old. I stopped at the top step. Something was out of place. I have a habit of checking the perimeter. I noticed the edge of the welcome mat was flipped up, just an inch. It was a brand new mat, heavy black rubber with no words on it. I hadn't moved it since I laid it down 2 days ago. I reached down and flipped it back. Lying there on the gray wood was a small envelope. It was a soft, pale blue, the color of a summer sky just before the sun goes down. There was no stamp, no postmark. Someone had walked onto my porch and tucked it there by hand. I picked it up. The paper was cool and slightly damp from the Oregon mist. I turned it over. My name was written across the front in a thin, elegant script that made the air in my lungs go cold. It was my mother's handwriting. I looked at the street. It was empty. The neighbor's dog barked once in the distance. I looked back at the blue paper. My thumb hovered over the seal, my heart hitting a jagged, uneven rhythm against my ribs. I didn't open it. Not yet. I just stood there in the fading light, the mud drying on my clothes, holding a piece of a life I thought I'd left in the dumpster. The war was over, but the shadows were still moving. The mist was finally letting go of the trees. It didn't lift all at once. It just thinned out, revealing a pale, buttery sun that caught the dew on the new grass. I stood on the porch, my boots caked in the mud of the flower beds I'd spent all week digging. In my hand, the blue envelope felt like a live wire. My name, Millie, was written in that delicate, cursive script my mother used for grocery lists and Christmas cards she was rarely allowed to send. I tore the flap. No fancy stationery, no floral borders, just a torn piece of yellow legal pad, the kind Richard used for his court notes. The message was short. It didn't have a header. Millie, I spent 35 years being quiet because I thought it would keep the peace. I was wrong. Peace isn't the absence of noise, it's the presence of justice. I let your father treat you like a footnote for 29 years, and for that, I'll never truly forgive myself. But I'm in Seattle now. I've got my own apartment. It's small, and the radiator clanks all night, but it's mine. I'm standing on my own 2 feet, and it's only because I saw you stand on yours. I'm proud of you, Millie. More than words can say. Love, Mom. I didn't cry. I'd grown out of that habit in the barracks years ago. Instead, I felt a strange, heavy warmth settle into my bones. It was the sound of a final bridge being built, one that didn't lead back to Richard. It was an apology without excuses. A casualty report where the survivor had finally crawled out of the rubble and started to walk. I folded the paper, the creases sharp and precise. I walked into the house, my boots echoing on the hardwood. The smell of fresh white paint was still sharp in the air, a clean chemical scent that had successfully wiped out the ghost of Richard's expensive cigars and Garrett's arrogance. I went into the room that used to be the judge's chambers. No more mahogany. No more dark wood panels that made you feel like you were already on trial. Just the grow lights and the long steel tables covered in trays of rich, dark soil. On my work table sat an old cedar box. I'd scraped the Walker nameplate off the lid a week ago. I opened it. Inside was the original note Grandma Eleanor had tucked into my hand when I was 12, right after Richard told me I was too emotional to ever handle the family business. Don't let them break you, Millie. You're the only one with the real iron in your blood. I laid Mom's yellow paper right next to Grandma's. 2 generations of women. Both had been silenced by the same man, and both had finally found their voice through the cracks in his empire. It wasn't just a house I'd won. It wasn't just a trust fund. It was the right to be the protagonist of my own damn life. I went to the kitchen and put on the kettle. The whistle was a high, lonely sound that filled the empty rooms. I didn't mind the silence. Silence used to be a weapon they used against me, a way to ignore my presence until I was needed to fetch a drink or move a box. Now, the silence was mine. It was the quiet of a base after a successful mission. Secure, controlled. I took my mug out to the porch and sat on the top step. The steam from the tea curled into the cold air. Down in the yard, the Sarah Bernhardt peonies were sleeping under a thick layer of mulch. They wouldn't bloom for months, but they were there. Roots taking hold. Preparing for a spring that didn't belong to Richard. Richard was gone. Garrett was gone. The placeholder was now the owner of the ground she stood on. I looked at my hands. They were stained with dirt and paint. My knuckles scarred from 10 years of service and 2 weeks of reclaiming this house. They were the hands of a worker, a soldier, a woman who knew exactly what she was worth. The campaign was over. I wasn't checking my six for an ambush anymore. I wasn't waiting for a mission briefing from a man who hated my strength. I was just Millie. And that was more than enough. Listen to me. If you're sitting there right now, feeling that familiar weight in your chest, the one that comes from being told you're the difficult one or the backup plan, I want you to look at your own hands. That seat at the kids' table, it only belongs to you if you're willing to sit in it. If you've ever felt the sting of being overlooked while the sharks in your family ate your future, I want you to hit that like button right now. Leave me a Roger in the comments if you're ready to draw your own line in the sand. I'm reading every single one. I took a long, slow sip of my tea. The sun was higher now, burning through the last of the Portland fog. The neighborhood was waking up. Dogs barking, cars starting, life moving forward. My phone buzzed on the wood beside me. A text from Caldwell. Trust transfer finalized. You're clear, Captain. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. I just watched a single robin land on the stone wall I'd rebuilt. It looked at me, chirped once, and took off into the clear blue sky. The war was won. The base was secure. I stood up, walked inside, and locked the door behind me. Not to keep the world out, but to keep my peace in. I was Captain Millie Walker, and I would never sit at the kids' table again.